Order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, all members shall have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. A quorum being present, we now proceed to today's business. The chairman will recognize himself for a brief opening statement. I put the emphasis on brief. I will jettison my prepared remarks because we are going to be our committee on the floor earlier than anticipated for S2155. We had anticipated marking up 5 measures. We will instead, I now anticipate that we will be marking up 3 measures. Mr. Hollingsworth and Mr. Holtgren are still working with members on their respective bills and have asked that we mark those up at a later time as they continue to find greater consensus on those 2 measures. So we do intend on marking up Mr. Pittenger's bill 5841, Mr. Barr's bill 5735, Mr. Duffy's bill 5793. We're going to start off with Mr. Pittenger's bill, which is FIRMA, the one that will reform CFIUS. We know that this is a very important matter of national security. I think we have broad consensus on that question. We certainly have regimes that either through shakedown or theft are taking the intellectual property and technology of our country. This is a very, very serious matter. And I want to thank Mr. Pittenger of North Carolina for his leadership, Mr. Barr as well, and on the other side of the aisle, I know Mr. Heck has been exceedingly interested and has led on this issue as well. I want to thank them all for their leadership. Should this bill be passed, then the concept of emerging technologies will be codified into law. Attention will be focused, hopefully, on the bad actors, but I do want to caution all members as we work through this, there is a balance to be had. A balance between how much power the legislative branch of government will be yielding to the executive branch. And there is also a balance, because I do not believe one can have a strong national defense without a strong economy and recognize the importance of foreign direct investment in economic growth in America. This particular issue has been the subject of at least 4 hearings and 3 classified briefings that members had an opportunity to avail themselves of. We have heard testimony from numerous experts, and that has led to the filing of a new bill, which we will mark up today. Then, in addition, we have 2 demonstration projects from our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, one dealing with mobility, one dealing with those recovering from opioid addiction. As a process matter, we are expecting first votes earlier than usual, somewhere in the 12:30 range. There will be, after that series of votes, 2 suspension bills, and then S2155 will be on the floor, which our committee is obviously managing. So I anticipate calling a recess at when first votes convene, and I do not anticipate gaveling back in until after we have completed the debate on 2155, which could be roughly in the 3:30 hour. And then I want to alert members on both sides of the aisle that we would expect to vote these 3 measures and any amendments potentially, hopefully today. Again, that pace is determined by how many amendments are offered, but I wish to alert members that there is a distinct possibility votes will be taken either late this afternoon or early in the evening. At this time, I now would recognize the ranking member for an opening statement for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was pleased last week the Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance finally held a hearing on homelessness in America. The hearing was the first focused on homelessness during your tenure as chairman. As you know, I've long requested that the committee turn its attention to this pressing issue. Today, there are over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness in America, over 1/5 of whom are children. It is simply unacceptable that in the richest nation in the world, we have children and families without roofs over their heads. Congress must take action, so it is encouraging that the committee has begun to take a serious look at homelessness and hear from experts on the issue. However, today's markup is yet another missed opportunity to consider and mark up any one of the many Democratic bills to address important housing issues, including the homelessness crisis. For example, I've introduced a number of bills this Congress that are aimed at improving the state of housing in this country. In April of last year, I introduced H.R. 2076, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2017, which would help to ensure that every American has a safe, decent, and affordable place to call home. The bill provides $13.27 billion in new funding over 5 years to federal programs and initiatives to prevent homelessness. We need a surge of new resources and a comprehensive plan to end homelessness in this country, and this bill provides a blueprint. As a Congress, we pour billions of dollars into defense spending. We should have the political will to also provide these much-needed resources to end homelessness. In June of last year, I introduced the H.R. 3160 Public Housing Tenant Protection and Reinvestment Act, which would ensure safe, decent, and affordable housing for the 1.1 million families who rely on public housing. We must preserve and revitalize the nation's public housing, which has faced chronic underfunding. The public housing system has a growing backlog of capital needs of over $26 billion, and many families in public housing are facing deteriorating living conditions that must be improved. These are just two examples of bills that should be considered by this committee, especially since there are a number of other housing bills on the agenda for this markup today. Mr. Chairman, this Congress, the committee, has held a series of markup large numbers of bills on a broad range of issues. In fact, we have already marked up 100 bills this Congress. Surely the committee can find the time to consider legislation to help the nation's most vulnerable families. I thank you, and I will yield additional time to the next Democrat.
The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think today's hearing is the most important of this Congress and for financial services. It's the most important, and it's also the most urgent, and it's a tad overdue because the White House and the Pentagon have been warning us for years of the vulnerabilities in our system for protecting our critical technologies from being sold or transferred to our adversaries. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, is supposed to be our primary line of defense against this danger. But it was created, frankly, in a simpler time, decades ago, and its tools are simply not able to deal with all the threats we face today. We all got a demonstration of that earlier this year when Broadcom, say that 3 times real fast, was nearly successful in using a legal loophole to transfer critical telecom technology to foreign ownership, despite CFIUS objections. So I welcome this markup. CFIUS legislation today before us isn't nearly strong enough, but it is a start. I look forward to working with the members of this committee to make it stronger as it proceeds through committee and the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 5841. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5841, to modernize and strengthen the Committee on Foreign Investment in the
Without
United
objection,
States.
the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Yes.
Copies of the amendment, the chair has been informed, have already been distributed and are on the dais. The clerk will report.
Amendment in nature, substitute offered by Mr. Pittenger. Strike all after the enacting clause.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Barr and Congressman Heck, for your good leadership on this very important legislation. Additionally, I would like to thank the dozens of staff, businesses, industries, and stakeholders, particularly my Chief of Staff, Clark Fonda, Assistant Secretary of Treasury, Heath Tarbett, who played a major role to push the issue of CFIUS reform to a markup today. Mr. Chairman, I have been working on CFIUS-related issues for nearly 3 years. Prior to FIRMA, I spent my efforts identifying problematic transactions and engaging in a public media campaign to raise awareness and stoke government action. Now, 3 years later, I'm happy to say that we have had a robust impact on this issue. For example, we have helped prevent the Chicago Stock Exchange from falling into the hands of opaque Chinese ownership. We protected our defense supply chain by helping stop Lattice Semiconductor from being purchased by a Chinese state-owned investment fund. We helped prevent the Chinese from exploiting important personal data during an attempt to purchase MoneyGram. Lastly, we helped push the government to fine ZTE over $1 billion for selling controlled technologies to Iran and North Korea. Our successful initiatives garnered the attention of Senator Cornyn. We began a year-long process to draft the original version of FIRMA. Mr. Chairman, over the past year or so, my staff and I have seen dozens of versions of FIRMA, both introduced versions and red line edits from various offices and stakeholders. For months, we have fought for the strongest CFIUS reform bill that was possible, that would preserve our foreign investment while preventing the sale of critical military-related technology companies. Today, we reach a milestone where committee action is imminent, which is a huge step forward for the cause of CFIUS reform. The House Financial Services Package, which I am the sponsor, includes a number of reforms to strengthen the current system and prevent the flow of military-applicable technologies to the Chinese government in particular. This is a compromise legislation that creates a process by which countries of special concern, which would include China, would have increased oversight when attempting to purchase critical technology companies in the United States. The bill also helps create an interagency process through export controls to review overseas joint ventures, a process that is absent under our current system. While I am pleased that we have gotten this far, I still fully intend to offer my opinions on both House and Senate versions of the bill as we move forward to pass a law. Both the House and Senate versions are departures from the original FIRMA concept. However, both would improve the CFIUS and export control processes, as well as have a strong impact on governing Chinese and other foreign investments. Regardless of which bill makes it to the conference committee, there are certain principles that should be addressed in the final version, I believe. For example, we must ensure that the Department of Defense and the intelligence community have a substantial role in the outbound review of joint ventures. We cannot have a scenario where a DoD review is arbitrarily rejected by the Department of Commerce. We must keep strong oversight over non-passive investments. We must also maintain a strong mechanism for CFIUS to examine all investments in the United States critical infrastructure companies to ensure maximum flexibility and coverage by the intelligence community. We should have a preemptive license requirement before control technologies can be transferred to embargoed countries. And lastly, we must work with our allied countries and incentivize them to improve their own CFIUS-like processes, including important information sharing mechanisms. We should not maintain the status quo when moving forward with a final CFIUS bill that could significantly jeopardize our national security. Secretary Mattis has personally asked for strong CFIUS reform, including his most recent letter to the Armed Services Committee on May the 4th, requesting passage of my original legislation, which I would like to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates has requested CFIUS reform to combat aggressive Chinese techniques to acquire technologies. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and NSA Director Admiral Rogers have both called for expanding CFIUS coverage. The House must respond and pass vital reforms to support our defense and intelligence communities. History will record whether we have done our job to prevent the transfer of proprietary intellectual property and critical technologies to adversarial governments. To this end, I am encouraged with the monumental step this markup represents, and I am grateful for the opportunity to help move forward important legislation to reform CFIUS and export controls. Mr. Chairman, thank you again, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the word, last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
First, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Heck, for their hard work, their extraordinary work on an issue that is vital to our national security. It is vital to our national security. And I have a long history of working on CFIUS issues. In fact, when Congress first codified CFIUS in 2007, it was my bill that was signed into law by President George W. Bush in a presidential bill signing, signifying the significance of the bill. When I was drafting that bill in 2007, we were primarily focused on transactions where a foreign investor, often backed by a foreign government, was taking control of a U.S. company and then using that controlling stake to take actions that harmed our national security. As a result, we required CFIUS to review any transaction in which a foreign investor was taking control of a U.S. company. But now our national security experts tell us that foreign countries are finding a way around this by taking a minority stake in a U.S. company and then demanding that the company transfer critical technologies, often military technologies, to the investor in exchange for the investment. We've also seen evidence of foreign government-owned investors buying real estate that is next to sensitive military installations, which can then be used to spy on our military. So now we need to update the CFIUS process to respond to these new problems, which is what this bill would do. Again, I want to applaud Mr. Pittenger, and I know that this is an issue that he cares deeply about. And I do want to say, Mr. Pittenger, that I'm very sorry that you're not coming back to this Congress. I think you've played a leadership role on many issues that are important to our country. And I also want to thank Mr. Heck, because even though I know he won't be supporting this version of the bill, he put in a great deal of effort into the original version of the bill and cares deeply about it. And I want to thank both Chairman Hensarling and Ranking Member Waters, who have worked very constructively with all of us on this legislation over the past several months. I deeply support the goals of this bill, which are to ensure that foreign investment is properly screened for national security purposes and to close the gaps in the current CFIUS process, most importantly, the gap that has allowed foreign investors to acquire sensitive technologies while avoiding any review of their investment by CFIUS. There have been several different versions of this bill, and this committee held 4 hearings on the original H.R. 4311. There was a robust debate about the scope of that first bill, which would have broadened CFIUS jurisdiction to include transactions that did not even involve an investment, where companies were exporting a technology, not the company investment, but selling a technology, and which have traditionally been covered by the Commerce Department's export control regime. I'm pleased that the scope of this new bill has been narrowed to focus on transactions that allow foreign investors to obtain sensitive personal data on U.S. citizens, and Mr. Pittenger gave us examples of some of those efforts that could threaten national security and transactions that could give foreign investors influence over technologies that are critical for our U.S. military. And this bill also beefs up our export controls by including a bipartisan bill that was introduced by the Chairman of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Royce, and Ranking Member Engel. This will ensure that sensitive technologies that the Pentagon uses to maintain our military superiority can't be transferred to foreign countries that may use them to challenge our military power. The one area where I still have a disagreement, and the reason that I cannot support this particular bill, is funding. I will be offering an amendment later that would provide CFIUS with a dedicated source of funding, and if my amendment is adopted, I will happily support this bill. But I want to touch on this issue briefly now because it's very important. This bill will significantly increase CFIUS's workload because it will be reviewing significantly more transactions every year. To address this increased workload, CFIUS needs a dedicated source of funding. Otherwise, CFIUS won't be able to properly vet transactions for national security threats, which could harm national security and throw sand in the wheels of commerce by unnecessarily delaying positive job creating investments. In any event, I hope that this key provision will pass with bipartisan support. My time is up, and I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to express my strong support for H.R. 5841, and I congratulate the work of its sponsor, Mr. Pittenger, as the chairman of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee. I also want to thank our ranking member, Mrs. Moore, and colleagues from both sides of the aisle who engaged with this issue over the course of 4 subcommittee hearings. Their voices were heard, and they are reflected in this legislation. I especially want to acknowledge the work of the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, who has been a tireless leader on the issue of CFIUS reform, bringing to this debate not only his expertise as a member of this committee, but also as a member of the Intelligence Committee. I know there are areas where he believes this legislation can continue to be improved, and I hope we can work in good faith to seek additional improvements. Mr. Chairman, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act has undergone changes since it was introduced last year, and those changes have made it even stronger on national security. We cannot underscore that point enough. FIRMA 2018 is a bill that will keep our country safe, and it will make our country safer, and for that reason, we should all support it. Let me address 3 gaps in CFIUS's jurisdiction that FIRMA 2018 addresses. First, it recognizes the need to prevent critical technologies from getting in the hands of problematic countries, including China and Russia, but it also uses the right tool for the job. Thanks to legislation authored by Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, and his ranking member, Mr. Engel, we're going to see a more robust interagency process that can identify new and emerging technologies. Through a revitalized export control system, those technologies and the know-how that underlies them can be kept out of the wrong hands, whether or not there's even an investment transaction. Second, FIRMA 2018 closes a loophole in CFIUS jurisdiction related to real estate near military installations and at U.S. ports. While CFIUS already has jurisdiction over other investments in U.S. businesses near these places, FIRMA 2018 prevents a hostile country from circumventing current law through the purchase of fallow land in sensitive locations. And third, FIRMA targets sensitive minority investments involving countries of special concern, including China, Russia, and state sponsors of terrorism. Early on in the FIRMA process, there was justifiable concern that Congress may expand CFIUS to all kinds of non-controlling investments, the vast majority of which are completely harmless. Rather than dump an enormous haystack on CFIUS's doorstep, FIRMA 2018 gives CFIUS that part of the haystack where we already know most of the needles are hiding. It's an approach that takes a realistic view of implementation, and for that, we should all applaud it. I want to dwell on implementation for a minute because it's central to this discussion. A CFIUS that lacks focus is a CFIUS that can harm rather than enhance our national security. A bureaucracy that's tasked with doing everything will end up doing nothing very well. FIRMA 2018 takes this risk very seriously. Even as it expands CFIUS's jurisdiction, it tailors that expansion to achieve maximum effectiveness. We should also note that if CFIUS is flooded with cases and buckles under the pressure, then our country's attractiveness as a destination for foreign investment will suffer. And while I'm not the first to tout the economic benefits of foreign investment, what should really concern us about lower investment is its effect on national security. This is how Clay Lowry, former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Affairs, put it during testimony before our subcommittee. Discussing the expansion in covered transactions under the original version of FIRMA, Mr. Lowry said, quote, "The expansion is not driven by national security. Instead, it would be the needless result of a bill that is too vague and too duplicative, rendering it practically impossible for CFIUS to accomplish the work it has been tasked to do, and that is so vital to U.S. economic and national security. Mr. Lowry echoed the sentiments of other former CFIUS practitioners from both Republican and Democratic administrations who appeared before our subcommittee, and we should be proud that their experience and expertise is reflected in the more targeted approach taken by FIRMA 2018. This is a bill that will close real loopholes while keeping the United States open for business. It's a bill that chooses to incentivize research and development here at home, not chase it away to foreign shores. It's a bill that understands we will outpace the rest of the world in technological advances, not by closing ourselves off from the world, but by constantly investing in innovation. It's a bill that strengthens national security without creating a sprawling bureaucracy that could ward off benign foreign investment, which fuels research and development and American economic competitiveness, which itself is an indispensable element of national security. Again, I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina and our colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their comprehensive examination of this issue. It's a product we should all take pride in, and I hope it will enjoy strong bipartisan support in this committee. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I just want to commend all of the authors on a bipartisan basis for the hard work, Mr. Pittenger, Mr. Parr, Mr. Heck in particular, and say that this process in the bill has really been good. The hearings and bipartisan input and buy-in have all been in place, and I think my colleagues have negotiated in good faith with tremendous candor and honesty. And it's my opinion that the bill before us today reauthorizes and updates the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, in a way that strikes a balance between national security concerns and continuing to permit the U.S. to be a destination for foreign investments. Now, you know, countries and companies, in fact, abused loopholes in the previous regime to put that sensitive technology at risk, and in some cases, permit hostile countries to spy on sensitive U.S. installations. I think the bill today closes loopholes in a manner that both permits foreign investment and makes the regime clear and administrable. Now, there are disagreements on this bill, and I think they come from a sincere place. And while I largely agree with the policy in the bill, I, like Ms. Maloney, have an overarching issue that renders the legislation highly problematic and probably doomed to failure. As every member on this committee and expert in this field knows, this bill contemplates and necessitates a workload for CFIUS review that is much higher than the current regime. And last year was the most of numbers of deals reviewed. But this bill lacks dedicated funding for CFIUS. Fact, people. And I think that every single one of us on this committee supports the expansion of CFIUS reviews in this bill, and some support it even for a greater regime. So it doesn't strike me as particularly controversial to ensure that CFIUS has dedicated funding to accomplish this goal. Industry wants this done right, and they want it done expeditiously. In my conversations, companies are happy to pay a fee so that adequate staffing is able to not only get the reviews right, but also get them done within the time frames contemplated by the legislation. It defies logic that we just gave stakeholders and CEOs $1.5 trillion in deficit-funded tax cuts, but now we can't ask them to pay a fee to fund national security reviews of their business products. The internal shuffling of resources is not a good long-term solution for this program that's so critical for national security and U.S. industrial leadership. Again, I want to thank Chairman Barr, Mr. Pittenger, Mr. Heck, and others for working in a bipartisan group, and they have gotten the policy largely correct. But I would urge adoption of an amendment that's going to be offered that provides a dedicated funding mechanism so that the law can be implemented and administered appropriately. And for the first time ever, I'm yielding back time.
The chair takes note and is so appreciative. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Foreign investment in the United States is critically important. In Texas' 25th Congressional District, attracting new business from overseas creates good-paying jobs and grows our local economy. This is evident across countless industries, from oil and gas to information technology. Since passing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, doing business in the United States is even more attractive to companies abroad. An overhaul of the federal tax code and the continued rollback of harmful regulations under this administration have been a welcome signal that America is once again open for business. While we encourage investment in the U.S., we must be sure to mitigate the risks associated with welcoming foreign investors with malign intentions. Our intellectual property and military technology must be protected against those who wish to exploit it. Our critical infrastructure also requires our attention, ensuring that our transportation infrastructure isn't ultimately dependent on foreign nations for development and upkeep. Mr. Chairman, I had the honor to visit with our service members deployed to Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait this month. I've never been so encouraged by our warfighters on the ground and the technological advantages that they possess. The bill before this committee makes significant strides towards safeguarding the United States against her adversaries through a modernization of CFIUS reviews. Increased scrutiny on threats to our national security and effects of foreign investment on keeping our military edge are welcome provisions in this bill. The national security complex of the United States of America is unmatched against our near-peer adversaries, and we must do everything possible to guarantee that remains. I'm happy to support this legislation and encourage all of my colleagues to stay focused on this important issue. We must continue to strike the proper balance between encouraging investment, instituting adequate and necessary views, and protecting our country against those who would exploit our welcoming business environment. With that, I yield the remaining of my time back to the chairman.
The gentleman follows the leadership of the lady from Wisconsin and yields back time. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The gentleman needs to hit his microphone there. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I think it's important that we strengthen the CFIUS process. I agree with the gentlelady from Wisconsin that we need a dedicated revenue source. It is not fair to burden the taxpayer with the costs of processing a transaction that the private sector has determined to enter. If a foreign company wants to invest in the United States and that raises national security concerns, it is the foreign company that should pay the cost of evaluating those concerns rather than taxpayers struggling to get by. Second, the bill avoids mentioning any country by name, but I think the record needs to be clear. When we say country of special concern, we include not only the state sponsors of terrorism, but we include Russia and China. These are two countries, substantial countries of great special concern. We need to strengthen the bill in a number of areas, but I do realize there has to be a balance here, because the greatest national security strength of the United States is our economy. That economy depends upon international business and investment, and we have to weigh and balance the need to have that economy grow. It is the source of our strength, with the national security concerns brought up by certain investments. Finally, I think it is important that we have a system that works quickly. We in government accept a level of delay that is inconsistent with the private sector, and the worst outcome of all is for a business deal that is in the national interest to not get done simply because it takes too long. I will be offering a number of amendments that I'll preview here. The first is to focus on the censorship effect of allowing countries of special concern to control our media, whether it is controlling cable channels or controlling movie screens or controlling studios. If no other country, and very few other countries in the world, would allow a hostile or somewhat hostile foreign power to control their media in a way that would make it impossible to, say, make a movie about what's happening in to the Uyghurs in China or to Tibet. Second, we should explicitly prohibit any investment by any company in any of the state sponsors of terrorism. Third, we should be able to look back in certain very narrowly defined situations, because you're going to have a situation where a foreign government or entities under its influence acquires control of what looks to be a benign technology, only to see that startup develop something of great national security significance. Fourth, we're going to need to look at when a CFIUS transaction risks a critical diminution in employment of people with critical national security skills. Because once we no longer have a workforce capable of doing the technological work, that impairs our national security just as much as any of the other issues that come up under CFIUS. Further, we need to strengthen the definition of foreign government-controlled transaction. There is a tendency in the United States to believe that other countries are just like us, that a private company in China is as private as a private company in the United States. This is simply not true. And when we allow an entity in China to acquire something of great national security concern on the theory that that entity is independent of and not influenced by its government, we try to impose and project our view of how an economy should work on a country that operates by a different system. With that, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I support the mission of CFIUS to protect national security, I do have concerns with lingering ambiguities around the definition and future application of the term critical and emerging technologies and the potential impact that the interpretation of the definition of this term may have on our medical device and technology community. I've raised similar concerns in hearings on this legislation, and I'm pleased to see some of the improvements that have been made. However, without additional refinements, the CFIUS review and export control process could unintentionally hinder the development and growth of the medical device industry that is not only important to my home state of Minnesota, but to people in the United States and around the world. As this process moves forward, I hope this committee, as well as other relevant committees of jurisdiction, will continue to work to refine the language and explore alternative ways to address these concerns. One such method would be to make FIRMA consistent with existing trade sanctions law by utilizing the framework codified in the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. TSRA, as it is known, ensures the key humanitarian products, agricultural commodities, food, medicine, and medical devices have unique status in U.S. national security, trade, and foreign policy. TSRA largely prohibits the imposition of unilateral measures on humanitarian products, requiring the relevant export control measures serve as appropriate guardrails for the trade in these critical products. Existing U.S. law supports the sale of humanitarian products to the most sensitive markets worldwide, and I believe the inclusion of this long-standing bipartisan policy is something that should be considered in this discussion. I want to thank Chairman Hensarling, Subcommittee Chair Barr, Representative Pittenger, and their staffs for their hard work on this important legislation, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this issue as we move beyond the committee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? For what purpose is gentleman from what purpose? What purpose does gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very interesting debate, and I'd like to just register a few thoughts of concern. First, I want to congratulate both my Republican friends and my Democratic friends in working on this. Mr. Heck, Mr. Pittinger, you all have been doing a great job. Ms. Waters, our ranking member, certainly raised some points, and as many on the Democratic side has sort of raised some points that it seems to me that we maybe need to slow down a bit. Because, Mr. Chairman, I think that this bill, this version of the bill, has a very serious oversight related to the authority we will be giving CFIUS to examine, and this is the way it is categorized, changes in rights of a foreign person with respect to a U.S. business. Because of the far-reaching nature of this provision, any number of personnel changes at many U.S. corporations could be captured under this expansion of CFIUS's jurisdiction and trigger a CFIUS review. And this could include major airlines in this country. And I would say that the United States provides, and all of our great airlines, the premier air traffic of this world. And they are already prohibited by law and regulation from being owned or controlled by non-U.S. citizens. So this broad expansion of CFIUS's authority to review changes in personnel at U.S. companies, Mr. Chairman, it cedes too much authority to the executive branch. Now, I love Congress, but the Founding Fathers made us co-equal branches. And why are we in Congress so eager to just cede so much of our authority to the executive branch? And we've got to be careful of that. It should be narrowed, particularly for industries that already face extensive citizenship and control reviews by other federal cabinet agencies, like U.S. airlines at the Department of Transportation. Addressing national security concerns is certainly an admirable goal. Put me at the front of the spear on that. But let's not saddle our U.S. companies with redundant regulations and oversight in the process of moving this bill forward. I believe we Democrats and Republicans can accomplish that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I want to commend my colleague and friend from North Carolina on this important piece of legislation. As a member of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, which I was privileged to chair in the last Congress, I've been struck by how thoughtful Mr. Pittenger, Mr. Barr, Ranking Member Moore, Mr. Heck, and so many others from both parties and both sides of the aisle have been in thoroughly examining the CFIUS reform. I do take some umbrage with my friend and colleague from Georgia. I disagree on this call to slow the process. It has been a long journey and cannot further suffer delay, frankly. This is something that we need to move forward on, and the MPT subcommittee held 3 oversight hearings and a legislative hearing this Congress, all of which brought together panelists, 4 of them, I'm being told, 4, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I might have missed one, I guess, in there. So, again, as like members both on the committee and off the committee, we've sat down with numerous stakeholders and former CFIUS practitioners and understand the implications of updating CFIUS's authorities. All of us here can be, frankly, proud of the open, thoughtful process, and H.R. 5841 is the fruit of that labor today, and I look forward to supporting it, committee. I would also remember that this legislation contains the first reauthorization of export controls in many years, and the product of bipartisan work with the Foreign Affairs Committee under the leadership of Mr. Royce, a member of this committee, and Ranking Member Engel, and they both deserve our recognition as well. So, Mr. Chairman, let me highlight one part of this bill that deserves, I think, special attention because of its approach differs from that of the Senate. One of the key provisions of FIRMA from the very beginning has involved non-controlling investments that may be a risk to national security. The Senate has approached this by establishing the notion of, quote, passive investment, and then anything that's not passive would be covered by CFIUS as long as an investment is made in a critical infrastructure company or critical technology company. Here's why I believe the House committee's approach is preferable. First, there is a simple issue of language. Passive investment is already defined in SEC rules. And by adding a new definition for foreign investors, we muddy the waters unnecessarily, in my opinion. We need that clarification. The SEC cannot and should not, and different government agencies shouldn't be dealing with different definitions of what a passive investor is. And I want to applaud Mr. Pittenger's approach rather than focus on the category of companies and sectors that rulemaking will have to further define. The bill starts with 2 basic questions. First, what are we trying to prevent from getting into the hands of bad actors? That seems like a logical baseline question. And 2, who are those bad actors? So, but building out from these questions, Mr. Pittenger's bill gets at a group of non-controlling investments that is much more manageable for CFIUS to tackle while being immediately relevant for national security. He's focused on the transfer of sensitive personal data, the decision-making over critical technology as targets for CFIUS scrutiny, and has tailored CFIUS's focus on those countries of greatest concern, including China, Russia, and others, as my colleague from California pointed out. This is a helpful strategy to triage investments so that CFIUS's resources are used most efficiently. So let me close with this question of resources, Mr. Chairman. The bill gets at resources in an important way because it requires Treasury to assess funding needs across all CFIUS agencies, mandates congressional testimony on resource adequacy, and gives CFIUS special hiring authority to fill positions more quickly. I am interested in hearing my colleague Ms. Maloney's funding proposal and where they think that this can and should come from. Again, I believe this process needs to move forward, and we can get there. We just need to have our folks on the other side to help us move that along. So these provisions are direct response to the GAO report published earlier this year, and they're a great start. And I know that we are going to be able to work together on that in good faith, and I hope that work can continue. So let me close by noting that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the Information Technology Industry Council, and other important associations stand behind this bill here in the House. And I'd venture to say that former CFIUS officials from both Republican and Democrat administrations, many of whom testified in front of our committee, will find much more of their expertise and insights reflected in the text. By voting for this bill in committee today, we are sending it to the next step of a process that all members can be proud of, and I urge my colleagues to continue their support of the process by supporting Mr. Pittenger's bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes, I'm sorry, for what purposes ranking members seek recognition?
I move to strike the last
Gentlelady's
word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Heck, who now for a good part of a year has been working very hard to ensure that any legislation addresses 3 key judicial gaps in the current scope of the authority of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. CFIUS serves an important function in the national security area, and this committee must ensure that it is appropriately balancing the benefits of our traditionally open investment climate with the need to protect our national security. I believe we all understand that the national security threats we face are both serious and evolving, and that the world has become a much more complicated place. As we evaluate the reform measures contained in this legislation, I think it's important to keep in mind that while there may be honest intellectual differences of opinion as to how best to counter the threat we face, we all understand that we have a responsibility to do so in the most effective and efficient way possible, and in ways that do not undermine the other important functions of government, many of which also contribute to our national security. Throughout the 4 CFIUS hearings held in our committee, this Congress, as well as several held in other House committees and the Senate Banking Committee, there's one overarching consensus that has been reached, and that is that CFIUS is currently under-resourced, and the enormous expansion of CFIUS jurisdiction that would occur under FIRMA without massive additional resources would undermine its mission. Another issue that has been addressed by some members in both chambers is the issue of foreign governments and foreign nationals attempting to influence the United States policy through their investment decisions in the United States. If these issues are not addressed, I believe we do a grave disservice to our national security, and I would urge my colleagues to work with me and others to further improve the legislation. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Gentleman from California seek, for what purpose?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just would begin by expressing my appreciation to you, Chairman Henserling, and to Subcommittee Chairman Barr for their leadership on this issue. But I particularly want to commend Mr. Pittenger, and I want to commend him and the other co-sponsors of this CFIUS modernization bill because of the tireless effort of their focus here on something that, frankly, is a challenge to the U.S. government and to our national security, and has been for some time. Their ability to focus this and force this forward is an extraordinary accomplishment, in my view. The U.S. is the world's largest exporter of goods and services, and our trade relationship and our leadership in science and in engineering and manufacturing support millions and millions of jobs, good paying American jobs in this country. However, as the sponsors of this bill have correctly observed, our competitive edge is increasingly under attack by policies directed from the governments of Beijing and, in some cases, Moscow and other countries as well, but principally from Beijing. And the focus here on their part is to obtain advanced technologies and intellectual property by hook or by crook. And making matters worse, our outdated regulatory safeguards have gaps that permit the transfer to potential adversaries of the know-how essential to sensitive emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics. In this global economy, turning inward is not the solution, but we also cannot allow others to cheat U.S. employers or, worse, use our sensitive technology to undermine our national security. And that's why the Foreign Affairs Committee passed the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. This legislation would repeal the expired Cold War-era Export Administration Act that was enacted back in 1979, and it would replace it with a permanent statutory authority to regulate dual-use items. So under our approach, modernized U.S. export control laws and regulations will continue to have broad authority governing the transfer of dual-use items and technology to foreign persons, whether that transfer takes place abroad or here in the U.S. And let me just highlight a few critical features of this measure in terms of the changes that are of interest to members of this committee. This language establishes a new authority for the U.S. export control agencies and the Department of Defense to work with industry, academia, and the intelligence community to identify and appropriately control emerging foundational and other critical technology that may be essential for our national security. This is aligned with the interagency approved language on emerging technologies that was circulated last month. It is consistent also with a similar provision in the Senate banking version of the bill. In addition, it requires an interagency review of U.S. dual-use licensing policy towards countries subject to a comprehensive U.S. arms embargo. This addition to the committee bill was added after consultation with the Commerce and Defense Departments. As well, it ensures that manufacturing know-how, which may include such items as written or oral communications, blueprints, engineering designs, and specifications, will be subject to appropriate export controls regardless of the nature of the underlying transaction. It clarifies that such controls apply to U.S. technology transfers to foreign persons, regardless of the type of transaction, such as a joint venture, a joint development agreement, or similar collaborative arrangement. So, Mr. Chairman, and I think this is the bottom line, Beijing is pursuing a whole-of-government strategy to acquire advanced technologies from the U.S. and our allies. Modernized U.S. export controls and CFIUS reforms are complementary responses to this challenge. Our goal is an efficient regulatory system that promotes both our national security and our economic prosperity. And in the combination in this legislation, I think we effectively have that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? Gentleman from Colorado seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And so Mr. Royce and Mr. Huizenga have kind of touched on the thing that I'm really concerned about, which is sort of loosening restrictions so that a country like Russia, which has interfered in so many ways that I can't count them all, has the ability to really play within a national security field as well as our economic affairs. We know they played in our political affairs and on our elections. And so my fear is that this bill allows them to have additional entry into our economy when, in fact, the sanctions that have been entered against them should be strengthened, should be enforced, and imposed. And so I'm looking forward to hearing the debate about whether this bill makes it easier for Russia to acquire sensitive technology that emanates from the United States of America. They've already played too crude and too much of a role in how our country conducts its affairs, and I don't want to see them have the opportunity to expand that when, in fact, we should be enforcing and strengthening sanctions against them. Mr. Royce focused on China, but I think the real bad actor here is Russia.
Will the gentleman yield?
I certainly will.
I certainly concur with you. And the focus is on China, and the focus is on Russia, and the focus is on other bad actors. And I am in complete concurrence with your observations.
All right, I thank the gentleman. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I really just want to thank all of our colleagues and, frankly, our staff here and, you know, the folks in the administration that helped weigh in on this. We had some good input from the private sector who've addressed a lot of concerns about the intersection of national security, intellectual property, and property rights, and a number of us were vocal about that, and I feel that the collaboration process that happened here and, frankly, in the SCIF, where we could address real concerns, real threats to our national security, was productive. And a lot of times here, people are concerned that there isn't a way to really collaborate, that there isn't a way to work across party lines, and frankly a way to engage people that aren't part of the government structure. But I really feel that in my short 2 years here, this is one of the more productive and comprehensive product development cycles that's gone into this piece, where you look at, we're about to launch a new product. It's a revision to an old one, but it's an important revision. And I feel that this is going to be a step in the right direction. I do share some lingering concerns about the loose language around critical technologies. I appreciate the need to anticipate the future, and I have been encouraged by the commitment to a sound rulemaking process, and look forward to ongoing oversight of this program. But it's been a great joy to be part of it and really feel that the time here has been productive on this bill. With that, I yield the balance of my time, and thank you to my colleagues. I look forward to voting for passage.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I have an amendment on the desk.
The clerk will pause just a moment. We will pause while the amendment is distributed.
It's a little bitty one.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
So noted. Clerk may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Amendment in the nature of...
Sorry, gentleman from Washington will suspend. Clerk may proceed.
Amendment in the nature of substitute offered by Mr. Heck. Strike all after the enacting clause. Insert the following. Section 1, short title, table of contents. A, short title. This act may be cited as the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2017. B, table of contents.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. So the gentleman from Washington is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill we're considering today was introduced last Wednesday. We haven't had a hearing on it. It does not have bipartisan support. It does not have Senate support. It does not have support from the National Security Committees. In fact, the Department of Defense strongly prefers the Crapo-Brown bill in the Senate and has, quote, serious concerns about this language. We are 18 months into this, in some ways, kind of starting from scratch, and I think that's a mistake. So I propose we jumpstart this process. I have here a substitute, which is the most recent revision of the CFIUS reform bill introduced last November. In this committee, we've frankly had a really good process, and I commend both the subcommittee chair and the ranking member of the subcommittee for our 4 hearings during which we've had feedback on the bill. We've incorporated that feedback and refined it through multiple drafts. And my proposed substitute does, in fact, have support from both parties. It has the support of the administration. It has the support of the Senate, where they're marking up the bill today. It has support from the National Security Committees, and it can become law. There is still a role, however, for this committee in perfecting the bill. There are small differences between this bill and the Senate bill, and there are issues still to resolve with the National Security Committees and with business experts. But with this substitute, it addresses the 4 national security gaps: land purchases, non-passive investment, rights changes, and joint ventures. It also, critically, provides resources and authorities needed to ensure the committee can implement its new responsibilities smoothly. I think those 5 areas remain key for any CFIUS bill that can command bipartisan support and solve the problem we are here to solve. H.R. 5841 does not address those 5 areas, and unless and until it does, I don't think it's going to become law. There are many differences between these bills, and I want to highlight 2. One is the scope of coverage. Right now, CFIUS only has jurisdiction over investments that give a foreign buyer control over the U.S. target. This substitute extends that jurisdiction so that CFIUS can review any investment that gives the foreign buyer access to U.S. technology, regardless of whether they actually control it. Because the danger we face today is not just that an adversary will buy our shipyards and tank factories and shut them down. It is that an adversary will erode or destroy our technological edge by taking our technology. A purchase, hear me on this, a purchase of, say, 49% equity by Russia in Diebold voting machine making company is not enough to control a business, but it may be enough to review the company's most sensitive research and development and to share that knowledge with adversaries abroad. CFIUS should be able to review that. It can under my proposed substitute. It cannot in the underlying bill. It cannot review Russia buying 49% equity in a voting machine company. Although this committee has not had a hearing on the underlying bill, it happened to come out the night before an Intel committee hearing on the strategic threat posed by China. I asked the witnesses in that hearing if a bill that fails to address access would be adequate to meet the threat, and they were unequivocal. No. H.R. 5841 fails to address access, and this substitute provides for it. This substitute also allows CFIUS to review investments to critical infrastructure companies. Homeland Security has designated 16 sectors of the economy as such, essential for the functioning of our economy. The U.S. military is charged with protecting these sectors against foreign military or cyber attack. For the same reason, we should be able to protect them against purchase by our adversaries. H.R. 5841 fails to address critical infrastructure. This substitute provides for it. Another issue is resources. We've talked about that at length. CFIUS is already facing an increasing workload, and meeting the challenges we have identified is going to drive up that burden still further. H.R. 5841 trusts in the appropriation process to meet those burdens. I don't, because frankly, we've lived through years of a dysfunctional appropriations process. We simply must address this issue as well. The substitute provides for resources. I urge your support of my proposed substitute. And with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? What purpose, gentleman from Kentucky, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank my friend from Washington for offering this amendment, but I want to address some of his arguments in opposition to his amendment. The first point that he makes is more of a process point. My friend talks about the fact that there's been no hearing on this legislation. I obviously take a strong exception to that. We've had 4 hearings on this. The input of the witnesses, the input of stakeholders has been taken into account. The gentleman's input has been taken into account. Members' input and concerns have been taken into account. And this is a process, and this is the substitute legislation that came out of that process. So this has been I'm very proud of the fact that the process has been very deliberative, and we want it to be bipartisan. It's been a very bipartisan exercise, and we want to continue to work with the gentleman and others, and we are doing that to address some of these concerns, but because we think that this is a national security issue and an economic competitiveness issue, and therefore it should be bipartisan, and at the end of the day, I think it will be. The idea that there's no support from national security committees, again, this is a process. It's a complex process because it's a multi-jurisdictional issue. And so there are different inputs from different committees of jurisdiction. This product is the input of this committee. We have jurisdiction. Foreign Affairs has jurisdiction. Mr. Royce, Mr. Engel did a great job in producing a modernization of export controls. We've imported their bipartisan work into this product, and this committee is putting its stamp on this product with this legislation. We want the input of the national security committees, and there will be a next stage to this process beyond this committee. With respect to the substitute FIRMA 2018 not addressing gaps, I strongly disagree with that characterization. This legislation addresses the three major gaps: the gap of outbound joint ventures, the gap of military installations and real estate in proximity to sensitive military sites, and also the issue of non-controlling investments. This legislation, make no mistake about it, this legislation extends CFIUS jurisdiction to minority investment, non-controlling investments, but it does so in a targeted way. It does so in a way that doesn't focus on non-threatening, non-sensitive investment. It focuses on the problem, and therefore we think we've calibrated it correctly. The gentleman talks about the substitute not addressing access. Well, here's what our substitute does do. FIRMA's 2018 provisions do not expand CFIUS jurisdiction to outbound technology transfers through joint ventures, and the reason it doesn't is because the imported Title VIII from the Foreign Affairs Committee, the modernized export control regime, does do that. Such transfers are the proper jurisdiction of export controls, which can restrict the release of critical technologies, including intangible intellectual property and know-how, whether or not even a transaction exists. In addition, our legislation puts explicit focus on sensitive investments involving countries of special control, tailoring CFIUS to the particular subset of transactions that are most relevant to national security. Ensnaring benign investment, ensnaring innocuous transactions does not advance the cause of national security. And also, the legislation's treatment of critical technologies makes an explicit link to U.S. export controls by updating CFIUS's review of such technologies through a regular and transparent interagency process, allowing for new technologies to be identified and evaluated for national security risks while providing U.S. companies with regulatory clarity. Meaning that as Mr. Royce's export controls system has been updated, that interagency process is also brought to bear in the CFIUS process as well. So I don't know what we're not addressing here. We're addressing emerging technologies, we're addressing know-how, we're addressing non-controlling investments, we're addressing minority investments, but we're addressing those that actually relate to the threat. The gentleman also makes the argument that the substitute doesn't address critical technology companies. Under our bill, the definition of critical technologies codifies existing CFIUS regulations, which define critical technologies as controlled technologies on U.S. munitions lists and the Commerce Control List, as well as controlled nuclear equipment and toxins. And in addition, this bill specifies that emerging technologies qualify as critical technologies if they've been controlled and made public following the interagency process described. So we're getting at the issue. We're not ensnaring a lot of unrelated issues that, frankly, are not sensitive to national security. And we'll address the resources issue throughout this hearing.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Maloney, page 49, after line 2, insert the following and redesignate the subsequent sections accordingly.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would provide CFIUS with a dedicated source of funding so that it has the resources it needs to properly carry out its new responsibilities under this bill. As I noted earlier, this bill will significantly increase CFIUS's workload because the number of transactions that CFIUS has to review will dramatically increase. In order to review and approve these transactions in a timely manner, CFIUS will need more resources and a dedicated source of funding that can increase when it has more transactions to review and decrease when it has fewer transactions to review. The original version of this bill that Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Hecht introduced last year would have allowed CFIUS to fund itself with filing fees, which would be paid by the parties to the transaction that CFIUS is reviewing, the investors and the companies, so it would be paid for by the foreign investors who are trying to buy American technology. And the bipartisan Senate compromise on CFIUS that the Senate Banking Committee is marking up as we speak, which was negotiated by Chairman Crapo and Ranking Member Brown, also includes a filing fee provision. And I understand that we might be voting on the Crapo-Brown compromise on the floor this week as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill. I will be supporting the Crapo-Brown compromise on the floor if we vote on it, because even though I think Mr. Pittenger's and Hecht's bill is superior in many ways to the Crapo-Brown compromise, the fact that it doesn't provide CFIUS with the resources it needs to properly protect our national security, I believe is a fatal flaw. Also, I don't think American taxpayers should pay the cost of a foreign country trying to buy our technology and the review of it. I think it's totally appropriate to let them pay their own costs. But my amendment would fix this fatal flaw by authorizing CFIUS to fund itself through modest filing fees, which even the companies and investors who would be paying the fees support. In my amendment, if my amendment is adopted, I would support the bill, and I would strongly urge my colleagues to support the bill as well, because I think that Mr. Pittenger and Chairman Hensarling have come up with a very good compromise on the scope of the bill. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I would also like to add that I have had some conversations with Leader Waters, the ranking member, and with Chairman Hensarling to continue working on this fatal and very important bill that I believe is strongly important to not only the national security of our country, but the economic security. And I would like to underscore my support for the comments of Chairman Royce, who is supported by Ranking Member Engel from the Foreign Relations Committee, for their input and support of this bill and the amendments and changes that they brought to it. I thank all my colleagues, especially Mr. Hecht, for his incredible hard work on it, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair will recognize himself. One, the gentlelady from New York and myself had a sidebar conversation, and I do want to acknowledge, I think there is obviously a broad acknowledgement that the workload of CFIUS will increase, and increase in a very major way. It is essential, I think both sides recognize, it is essential that CFIUS be resourced adequately. I think that the main debate is exactly how do we go about doing that. So The version of the bill from Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Barr has that going through the appropriations process. For those who don't have faith in the appropriations process, I would offer the opinion it's our process. It is Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, and it is, I believe, still critical to our oversight role. It is what we do. We pass laws. We have oversight over executive agencies executing that law. Having said that, I am not I'm not religiously opposed to the idea, but I still have a number of concerns. It has been raised whether or not such an assessment would bring retaliatory trade measures from trade partners. The issue has been raised by the Congressional Research Service whether or not such would be WTO compliant, something we have agreed to. That is an open question. In the current form of the gentlelady's amendment, I think I have the most current form, there is no ceiling on this. And I would remind colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we're writing permanent law here. So there's a Republican in the White House today. There could be a Democrat tomorrow. There could be a Republican next Wednesday. There could be a Democrat in the future. We don't know. We want to make sure that Congress doesn't lose its oversight and that such is not abused. And so I'm concerned also that if there is a fee to be assessed, that it is commensurate with the needs of this new CFIUS regime that I think we're on the precipice of enacting. I am concerned, finally, that although I'm not a collectivist, if there's anything that has been collectivized, it is the expense for national defense. I think we all broadly agree that CFIUS is about national defense. I'm somewhat concerned about setting a precedent, for example, that those of us who live on border states might be assessed a special tax for national security related to the border. And so if it's a national defense expense, then it ought to be recognized as such. And again, I want to emphasize how important foreign direct investment is to economic growth. And at the end of the day, our national security depends on economic growth. Now, coming full circle, I want to pledge to the gentlelady from New York, I want to find a mechanism to give members on both sides of the aisle a high level of comfort that CFIUS will be resourced properly. I do not, again, I'm not religiously opposed to a fee, but I am concerned about it for the following reasons. If the gentlelady wants to offer an amendment, that is fine. If she is interested in withdrawing it, she would have my pledge to work with her on good faith to make sure that CFIUS is adequately resourced with the distinct possibility that fees could be part of that process, but also the concerns I have I would like to see addressed. And so that would be my pledge to the gentlelady from New York if she chose to withdraw the amendment at this time. Chair yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members, I commend the gentlewoman from New York for offering this amendment, which in my view is the most important issue we face right now in this context. Whatever the bill looks like, whether it is more interventionist in defense of national security or less, if CFIUS isn't adequately budgeted and staffed properly, nothing else matters. Budgeting and staffing is the most important thing, and then the goals all follow from what you're willing to provide in terms of resources and people. The imperative need for additional resources is an issue that has been discussed at every hearing in both the House and the Senate by every witness, by every former administration official, every current administration official, and by members on both sides of the aisle. And yet, this bill does nothing to provide additional resources, and that's a serious mistake. Assistant Secretary Tarbert has said that ensuring that CFIUS has all the resources to meet its obligations could mean shifting resources inside of Treasury to ensure that CFIUS has what it needs. That's not an acceptable approach to me. I do not support taking funds from other important government functions to support review of multi-million and multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisitions. But recognizing that those reviews are important, this amendment authorizes such sums as may be necessary to perform the functions of the committee and also mandates the imposition of a filing fee by CFIUS on companies that file with CFIUS based on the value of the transaction and taking into account a number of other factors, including the effect of the fee on small business concerns. In closing, vastly expanding the scope of CFIUS absent additional resources will not only undermine CFIUS' mission, it will also deplete other important government services and functions both domestically and internationally, and that will undermine U.S. national security from the inside out with no one to blame but ourselves. So I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I'll be brief, and I also want to commend my friend from New York for identifying this issue. It's a major issue, and it's absolutely correct. As we expand CFIUS's jurisdiction to non-controlling investments, as we require more of our export control system, we absolutely need to resource it, and I agree with the ranking member as well. She's correct. We need to resource this expanded process to actually effectuate the national security gains that we're seeking to achieve here. Again, the issue, and I agree with the chairman, the issue is how are we going to resource it? And the bill that we're debating, the underlying bill that we're debating, I will just point out, it does require a detailed spending plan for all CFIUS's member agencies, which is a direct response to the recent GAO report that called for better Treasury coordination of resources across agencies. It also requires that the chairperson of CFIUS or a designee testify annually before our committee, before the Financial Services Committee, to discuss adequacy of resources. And as the chairman pointed out, it is our responsibility as the authorizing committee and whatever other authorizing committees that would have jurisdiction over the oversight of CFIUS to weigh in as well with respect to budgeting. I will note one of the concerns that I have, that other members have, and stakeholders and former CFIUS practitioners have related to the idea of a filing fee, is that, and the Congressional Research Service has noted this, that, quote, imposing a fee for a national security review or investigation may well be viewed by foreign investors as a tax on foreign investment, and contrary to the thrust of U.S. and international foreign investment policy since the end of World War II. The chairman pointed out the implications for perhaps WTO compliance, but the other issue that's a real issue is the potential that this could lead to lowering levels of foreign investment and reciprocal retaliation by foreign jurisdictions. If they perceive us as putting up a fee for direct investment into the United States, there could be retaliation, which would compromise open and free investment climate cross-border. So the concern is a very legitimate one. I commend my friend from New York for raising it. I don't like the solution that she's offered. However, what I will commit to you is offering an amendment of my own that would address resourcing from an authorization standpoint to make sure that this Congress is addressing that very legitimate issue. And I'll yield.
I think he's yielding to the, are you yielding to the gentlelady from New York?
I'll yield to the,
okay, I think if you're ready to yield back, I think the gentleman from North Carolina.
Yield back to the chairman.
Well, I think the gentleman from North Carolina was looking for some time. I don't know if he can get done in 2 minutes, but he could start.
Strike the last word. Yes, sir. To your point, Mr. Chairman, I would say that the appropriation process was included in the first FIRMA bill, but as well there was a fee, which would be capped at $300,000 or 1%, whichever is less. I think we pay filing fees when we go to run for a public office, so they're not uncommon. So I think that struck a balance, maybe something that should be considered. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back.
Back.
Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? Gentleman from California seek recognition.
To strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I think it's appropriate for corporations and investors to pay their own way. When someone wants to visit our country, they pay a fee to process their visa. To say that they might be regarded as a tax, there are many cases in court that define the difference between a tax and a user fee. I don't suggest that we try to make a profit on this and transfer it to the U.S. Treasury. The fee that would be imposed, if I understand the gentlelady from New York's amendment, is just the cost necessitated by the decision. And if the corporation doesn't think its decision is profitable enough to pay the costs of doing the processing, then they shouldn't go forward with the decision. To say that our corporations will then have to pay a fair processing fee for their work overseas just means that corporations will pay their fair share on both sides of the ocean. And to say that it might deter, prevent American companies from investing overseas, since so many of those investments mean the loss of jobs, I will shed few tears. To say that that if somebody wants to visit our country and we do a review and a process before we give them a visa, and we charge them a fee, that's okay because they're an individual. But if somebody wants to take control of a strategic American corporate business asset, that we don't charge them a fee for a review of the national security issues involved, is to say that corporations outrank people, that those who want to control strategic business enterprises are somehow more noble than tourists who want to visit Disneyland. So I applaud the amendment. I think it's only fair that the corporate world pay these fees, and I think that the business community would be very happy. I don't see the business community lobbying much against these fees, since their biggest concern is the speed of the processing rather than whether the processing requires a processing fee. With that, I'd yield to the gentlelady from New York if she would want the time, and otherwise, do you want the, yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would like to be associated with his remarks. I agree with him completely, and also the important issues that were raised by Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Barr. My main thrust of this amendment is to make sure that the cost is paid for. As a member of the minority, I don't have a great deal of trust in the Appropriations Committee because a lot of programs that Democrats vote completely and totally 100% for are defunded. Just look at the Carson housing proposal that decimates affordable housing. I believe every Democrat will be voting against it, but we may not prevail. So the appropriations process is important. It belongs to Congress, but it belongs to the majority. And I would support going forward working together, as the chairman has mentioned, not only on the fee for what the foreign government is trying to do, but also an appropriation to strengthen the operations of CFIUS. I have had meetings with members of the European Union who have described very complicated efforts of a foreign government to gain control of a technology or the whole control of some vital element that you need in the economy. And they'll see they buy one element from one country, one from another, one from another, one from another. You need to see the whole picture of what's happening, of what's and assess it. And I would say that the businesses that I hear from, they could care less about a fee. Most countries block us from going in any way, shape, or form, or many do, with our investments. So this is, if there was a area we should agree on, I believe it is in the national security of our country, and if we can see that if we do not agree, often the work is erased when the other country, other party wins. We've seen that in many ways in this current administration. So I would like to withdraw my amendment on the agreement that the ranking member and that the chairman of the committee and the other members who are interested, such as Mr. Barr and Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Hecht and others, and Mr. Sherman and others, that we can work this out in a way that handles it and makes it stronger. And as I said, if it's a WTO violation, it's a WTO violation to the Senate bill, because the Senate bill has this language in it, as did the original Pittenger bill. So I will respectfully withdraw it under the promise to work together on a solution to make this bill even better and even stronger.
If the gentlelady will yield time that the gentleman from California does no longer have, the gentlelady from New York has my commitment. And again, I am open to the fee structure as long as we can ameliorate the concerns that I articulated. And I appreciate the gentlelady for withdrawing, and she has my firm commitment. We will figure out some solution to this.
Thank you very much. And if it's bipartisan, then it's a respected law in our country that will not be overturned by the next administration, which is a big achievement for our national security.
The time of the gentleman from California has long since expired. Who seeks recognition?
Green from Texas.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Against this.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Green, page 9, after line 13, insert the following.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is then dispensed with. The gentleman is now recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is about transparency and accountability. The transparency necessary for us to acquire facts, intelligence, if you will, such that accountability can be imposed when necessary. The amendment simply requires the President to issue a report to Congress explaining a decision, suspending or prohibiting a covered transaction if it is based on any grounds other than the recommendation of the CFIUS committee. The amendment will not prevent the President from doing his job. It does not interfere with his work in any way. It does not influence his decision in any way. It simply allows Congress to have an opportunity to review in the sense that we can actually acquire intelligence on the rationale for a decision that is made. Mr. Chairman, it is no secret that we have to guard against corruption and bribery and other threats to national security. This is not directed at any given president, but it would apply to all presidents. And I surely believe that it is something that would be beneficial to we who ultimately have some responsibility for the laws that we enact, such that they do not become a means by which persons can benefit themselves personally. I think that this is a very simple and straightforward amendment, and my hope is that it would be acceptable. With this, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlemen, does the gentleman from Kentucky withdraw his point of order?
Yes.
Who seeks recognition? Does anyone seek recognition? Then the chair, for what purpose, gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, I appreciate the gentleman's the thoughts of the amendment. I oppose the amendment because I think the underlying legislation that we have addresses all malign foreign investment, regardless of the source or how or wherever it's directed, and it's neutral in that regard. And it addresses the gaps that have been identified by the witnesses. It identifies gaps with respect to non-controlling investments, with respect to critical technology companies where there is a risk of, where there is a national security risk of a technology transfer. It addresses through the strengthened export control system the risk that has been identified to us by our witnesses relating to outbound foreign investment joint ventures where there could be a transfer of critical technology. It addresses the sensitive military sites, and in that regard, it addresses the national security concerns in a very neutral way and an across-the-board way. And so I'm not really sure, other than maybe a political point that's trying to be made, what this amendment would add. So again, I oppose the amendment because I think the underlying legislation that we have actually addresses the national security threats that our witnesses through our hearings have identified for us, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Last March, it was reported that the Chinese company Anbang Insurance Group had proposed investing in a Manhattan property at 666 Fifth Avenue, which happens to be owned by the company belonging to none other than President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner. At the time, the proposed deal came under intense scrutiny. Real estate experts called the terms Anbang had proposed unusually favorable to Kushner companies. Specifically, Anbang proposed making a $400 million cash payout to the Kushner family, knocking $200 million off a Kushner family mortgage and allowing the Kushner family company to maintain a 20% stake in the property's retail space. Such favorable terms raised serious concerns that Anbang was attempting to use Kushner's business to curry favor with the Trump administration and potentially undermine U.S. national security by attempting to influence U.S. foreign policy. After a great deal of criticism, Anbang withdrew from the deal, and notably, months later, the Chinese government seized control of the company. Separately, in January of this year, it was reported that Kushner companies had received an approximately $30 million investment from one of Israel's largest financial institutions to pump equity into 10 Maryland apartment complexes controlled by the Kushner family. 1 month later, in February, it was revealed that officials from countries, including Israel, had discussed ways in which they could use Kushner's intricate business arrangements to manipulate him. These are just two examples of numerous ways in which foreign investors have tried to influence top-ranking U.S. government officials. This administration's extensive business ties, which extend to foreign countries, have resulted in unprecedented conflicts of interest. Mr. Chairman, our national security should be a priority for all of us, regardless of political views. This amendment would ensure that CFIUS reviews transactions involving a foreign investment in a United States business that would materially benefit the President, Vice President, or any high-level official of the United States in order to determine whether such transactions are or could be perceived as efforts to influence U.S. policy decisions. We should all be able to recognize that this is a critical national security goal, and I urge members to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there further
Mr. Chairman,
for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
A request for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion? Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
I understand the gentleman has several amendments. This one is styled.
Number
How is
one.
it styled?
Sherman 1.
Sherman number 1. We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Chairman, should I proceed?
We're still allowing the amendment to be distributed.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, should I proceed?
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Sherman, page 30, line 14, strike 16 and insert 17. Page 32, line 6, strike and. Page 32, after line 6, insert the following. 16, the potential of the covered transaction when a party to such transaction is a foreign person of a country of special concern as defined under subsection A3C13 to result in substantial direct or indirect censorship, including with respect to the distribution of entertainment or informational products within the United States. And page 44, line 14, insert the following. Section 402, report of transactions with censorship implications, not later than 1 year from the date of enactment of
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment deals with countries of special concern: China, Russia. It is very clear that neither of those two countries would allow Americans to own the smallest radio station or to have any real control over media, entertainment, and its distribution. I'm not for such rigorous controls on our end, but it does concern me when particularly China is in a position to control the commanding heights of the system for distribution of entertainment. If China buys HBO, there will never be a movie that depicts the Chinese government as repressive, because you won't be able to sell it to HBO. If, as is the current case, Chinese interests control one of the largest theater owners in the country, then every studio in Hollywood knows that if you make a movie about Tiananmen Square, that movie will be banned from at least a fifth of the screens in the United States. If we continue to allow unfettered ownership of those critical elements of our media that allow for movies to be distributed, that allow for content to be controlled, then the attempt recently to affect our election will be thought of as just an opening salvo. We should have CFIUS look at a situation in which Chinese or Russian concerns are putting themselves in a position to deprive the American people of any entertainment message that Beijing does not like. And when you compare this to the restrictions that Russia or China would place on any acquisition of movie theaters, distribution, etc., in their country, it is the lightest of all is the lightest touch. With that, I hope to have your support in the amendment. This is obviously critical to the city that the ranking member and I represent, and I don't want to be in a position where you can't get your project made because Beijing finds it objectionable. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For purposes, the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I respect our colleagues' engagement with CFIUS modernization, and in particular this concern that he has with the censorship, and he's been actively involved in our consideration of this bill throughout our hearings. I do oppose his amendment, however, because its terms are too vague, and even if they were better defined, the amendment itself wouldn't add to CFIUS's scrutiny of investments. For instance, what is, quote, substantial censorship, unquote? And how would CFIUS distinguish that from the non-substantial kind? How would they identify, quote, indirect, unquote, censorship? Is the censorship of U.S. or foreign persons? So while we certainly are all critical of certain countries' intentions to push false narratives or whitewash history, we also know that in the wrong hands, government authority to determine as what counts as censorship in the entertainment industry can get dangerously close to infringing on free speech. For instance, if I don't voice agreement, can the government accuse me of self-censorship, to use the amendment's language? This simply is a road we don't want to go down. Moreover, CFIUS doesn't need to be told to worry about Chinese or Russian investments in the entertainment industry. They already consider a broad range of factors, even factors that may not appear in statute, to assess the national security risk that such transaction poses. So again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate my colleagues' intentions with this amendment, but the unintended consequences that lead me to urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Do you yield to the gentleman from California?
I will yield to the gentleman from California.
I mean, I'd be happy to work on language. This bill does not deal with what any American does. It does not deal with what any company based in one of our friendly countries does. Its focus is on Russia and China controlling our media. Now, if we want to limit it to not controlling more than 10% of the distribution channels for in-home entertainment, or 5% of in-home entertainment, or no more than a particular percentage of movie screens we could add some numerical specificity to the amendment. But for us to say that current law does not would prevent HBO, Showtime, and Netflix from all finding themselves under Chinese control is simply not a statement of existing law or the law that we're considering here today. If we don't put something specific in here, then yes, indeed, if there's some new aviation technology, the Chinese won't be able to buy the company that controls it. But they can control the decision-making process in this country by buying, as I said, Netflix, Hulu, HBO, and any one of the major theater exhibitor chains. He who controls how movies are distributed controls what movies are made. The Chinese already have substantial economic control because when movies are made, only 35 American movies can be distributed in China. So they can inform every studio that not only if you make a movie about Tibet will we not show it in China, but if you make a movie about Tibet, your action thriller that has nothing to do with Tibet will also not be shown in China. So China already exercises substantial control over what goes on in Hollywood, and I think it's time that we draw the line before we find that Netflix is Beijing Flix.
Would the gentleman yield to the chair? I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. Listen, I think the gentleman from California raises a valid concern. We're all concerned about ultimately who may control our media. I must admit, as a Texan, I'm very concerned that people in New York and California would control my media as well. Having said
Mr.
that,
Chairman, I do want to clarify that the
time belongs to the gentleman from Kentucky.
If I originally get
the time belongs to the gentleman from Kentucky. But I would say that seriously, the gentleman from Kentucky brings up some serious issues with respect to lines 1 through 7. And that, unfortunately, Congress often excels in unintended consequences. This is a serious discussion. I ask unanimous consent the gentleman from Kentucky get an additional 1 minute without objection. And so I still find, as the gentleman from Kentucky does, that this language is a little bit problematic. Maybe it could be improved. I certainly would agree personally and would recommend to the gentleman from North Carolina and the gentleman from Kentucky that we accept the study portion, if the gentleman was willing at this point to delete lines 1 through 7 and work with us on alternative language. We're, I think, prepared to accept the study. If not, at this point, we are not prepared without further...
I look forward to working with the gentleman and other interested parties on the real teeth of the amendment, lines 1 through 7, but withdraw that at the present time and ask that the amendment start on line 8.
I'd be happy to accept that amendment.
The clerk will redesignate the amendment from the gentleman from California without lines 1 through 7.
Amendment offered by Mr. Sherman, Section 402, report on transactions with censorship implications. Not later than 1 year from the date of enactment of this act, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States shall issue a report to the Congress, appropriate portions of which may be classified on investments by foreign...
Without objection, for the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. I think we all get it at this point. So we are now left with what was previously lines 8 through 14 on page 1 and lines 1 through 4 on page 2. So the amendment has been redesignated. Is there further debate on the amendment from the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman? If not, all those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
have an amendment on the desk, Mr. Chairman.
We'll pause. And does the gentleman have multiple amendments?
Yes, I have two, sir.
Okay, so this is your second and final?
No, I have.
Okay, this
three
is
in total.
styled amendment number 1. How's the amendment styled? Which amendment?
This is the one deals with critical infrastructure.
Okay, we'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck, page 10, after line 16, insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would simply extend the non-passive scope of coverage of the bill to include critical infrastructure as well as critical technologies. Most of the public debate on this issue has been focused on protecting cutting-edge technology, but we should remember that the last major CFIUS legislation was motivated by a desire to protect critical infrastructure, such as ports, from foreign control. In fact, the existing law makes a presumption that transactions that could result in foreign control of critical infrastructure should proceed to the second stage of CFIUS review, and requires the joint approval of the Secretary of Treasury and the head of the lead agency on the transaction, even to waive that requirement. Obviously, we all know that failure to protect our critical infrastructure could be devastating, and you don't need control to critical infrastructure to inflict harm. For example, just having visibility into a utility company and being able to understand, for example, what precautions they've taken against cyber attacks makes it easier to breach their defenses and bring down the power grid. Having a tougher process in place for critical infrastructure transactions that result in control, but no process for non-passive investments that fall short of control, frankly leaves a gaping hole in our defenses, which our adversaries would seek to exploit. Crapo Brown and the original FIRMA included critical infrastructure in their scope of coverage, and the definition I'm offering for a critical infrastructure company is the same as Crapo Brown. My intention here is just to establish consensus that we need to be looking at non-passive investments in critical infrastructure, not just critical technology, because I think that's something, frankly, that we all ought to be able to agree on is in the interest of our national security, particularly since, as drafted, it would apply only to nationals from countries of special concern like China and Russia, who clearly have no business owning our critical infrastructure. So I hope that we can agree on this amendment and have strong bipartisan support for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose is the gentleman from Kentucky?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I oppose the gentleman's amendment. I do understand his concern that, and I think he mentioned this in his other amendment, that the concern that he has is that you don't need control over critical infrastructure always to cause harm, that access or insight into critical infrastructure is the issue. But I think the underlying legislation actually deals with that issue. What we don't want to do is create this unintended consequence of creating a haystack and not being able to find the needles in the haystack. And the only reference that the government has to critical infrastructure is the Department of Homeland Security classification, where DHS classifies 16 sectors of the economy, including banks, farms, manufacturing, retail, restaurants, and others, who primarily provide a service to them. The gentleman's amendment would open the door, dramatically enlarging the jurisdiction of national security reviews to totally innocuous activities. It could include even a farmer that provides a review of a farmer engaged in a transaction providing some kind of product, or even the veterinarian service serving the farmer that then provides some kind of service or product to a critical infrastructure firm. So again, we want to focus on the real concern. I have a facility, a manufacturing facility in my district, Toyota Motor Manufacturing of Kentucky, okay? The janitorial small business that serves Toyota could be ensnared in CFIUS review if the gentleman's amendment were made in order. So let's not include everything in the definition of critical infrastructure. Let's not overload CFIUS reviews with janitorial firms, with manufacturing firms, with farmers, when that really is not what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about in our bill is what you are getting, what the technology, what the critical infrastructure is, what the critical technology is that could be transferred. So unless the gentleman can clarify that for me, that's my concern with his amendment. That again, we don't want to create a haystack. We want to focus CFIUS like a laser on those risks that really would compromise national security. And
were you asking me to yield by that?
I'm happy to yield to the gentleman if he wants to clarify why his amendment would not ensnare all these kinds of innocuous activities and actually burden CFIUS to the point where it's really losing focus on the national security threats. And I yield.
Thank you, sir. Well, to begin with, CFIUS has the authority under the legislation by rule and regulation to narrow its focus. So it seems to me far-fetched to suggest that CFIUS would be looking for de minimis, nonsensical, or irrelevant efforts to undertake when they already have before them and would under either the underlying bill or the proposed substitute that I offered pretty significant concerns to deal with. But I would be glad to clarify even further if, for example, that you could clarify what it is in the underlying bill that actually deals with these concerns. I mean, my base concern here was they could purchase 49% of a privately held utility, and we would have no opportunity to necessarily trigger the CFIUS process. There's nothing in the underlying bill that will enable us to have the authority to get under that. The essence of your concern seems to be that it would have the potential to dramatically open the door. And again, CFIUS can narrow it by rule and regulation. Secondly, I have yet to hear anybody cite an instance of CFIUS jumping in the deep end of the pool, frankly, to deal with something like a janitorial service ever in the decades that they have had it here. These are serious people across the federal government agencies that have to deal with serious threats to our national concern, and frankly, I find the example to be far-fetched at best.
Will the gentleman yield?
It's your time, sir.
Well, I'll reclaim my time, sorry. In reclaiming my time, if the concern is utilities, for example, under FIRMA 2018, under our legislation, without the amendment, the interagency process would have all the authorities it would need to specify that as an area of concern, a critical technology, emerging technology that would qualify for CFIUS review. So again,
the time of the gentleman has expired. I think the exchange is useful. I ask unanimous consent the gentleman from Kentucky be granted an additional 2 minutes for purpose of this exchange without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that additional time. I'll be brief. The point is that under the export control section of the bill, Title 8, the enhanced, strengthened export control regime, in Section 819, the section requires the President to establish an interagency process to identify emerging, foundational, and other critical technologies that are not identified in any U.S. or multinational export control list, but nonetheless could be essential to U.S. national security. That process is then imported into the CFIUS reviews. And CFIUS would have full authority under this legislation to assess whether or not any transaction would result in sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens being exploited or influence over the use or development, acquisition, release of such data or critical technologies. And there's a specific link to that U.S. export controls, that updated interagency process that would allow for new technologies to be identified and evaluated for national security risks. And that would provide U.S. companies with regulatory clarity, as opposed to just opening the door to any and all of firms out there. This is a more focused approach. I yield back.
Gentleman yield back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes? Gentleman from Missouri seek recognition.
We'll strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead and proceed.
I'd like to yield time to Mr. Heck.
Gentleman from Washington.
I thank the gentleman from Missouri. Look, I know it's frustrating to look for a needle in a haystack that represents a threat to our national security, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't examine the haystack, period. The fact of the matter is that the example the good gentleman from Kentucky used is simply not applicable. It deals with outbound technology, not domestic infrastructure, not non-passive. We took the non-passive out, which I think was a mistake. So at the end of the day, frankly, even though this is difficult, it does not mean that we shouldn't undertake it. In fact, we should undertake it. And yes, this is a balance between how intrusive this process can become against the need to have continued foreign investment in our economy. I have said from day one that we need to continue to have foreign investment in the U.S., and it is a part of what makes our economy strong. But I will say, as I have before, again, the fact that foreign countries want to invest in our economy is because we have, in part, a national security. And those companies can thrive, our domestic companies, if and only if we maintain our competitive advantage. The world has changed since the last time we updated CFIUS. We have not changed with it, and the underlying bill doesn't go far enough to change with the world we're confronting now. Yeah, let me say it a third time. It's frustrating to look for a needle in a haystack, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't look for it if that needle represents a threat to our national security. Nothing the gentleman from Kentucky has said, nothing discounts the example I used. If China or Russia want to buy 49% interest in an investor-owned utility in this country, in a massive electrical grid associated with that, CFIUS can do nothing. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman from Missouri with my gratitude.
Will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back the balance of his time. The chair will recognize himself. I share the concerns of the gentleman from Kentucky. I mean, what the gentleman from Washington's amendment says is critical infrastructure is whatever CFIUS says critical infrastructure is. Sky is absolutely the limit. I agree with the gentleman from Kentucky. We need to focus on the real problem. And the real problem is technology transfer or a controlling interest. I think the allusion the gentleman from Washington made earlier might have been the Dubai Ports case, but if memory serves me correct, that was a controlling interest. Otherwise, I do not believe they would lift up an entire port, an entire bridge, or 100 miles of asphalt and transfer it to another country. Yes, controlling interest in a narrowly defined critical infrastructure definition could be very, very helpful. But to simply say critical infrastructure is whatever who happens to be sitting at the CFIUS table decides it is, to me, is an incredibly overly broad yielding, yet again, of Article 1 powers to Article 2. Going to, again, a terrible trend that has taken place within Congress over decades. We wish to empower those on the front lines of national security, but with proper authorization. Again, this particular, listen, I appreciate the gentleman from Washington. I appreciate his leadership. I appreciate his knowledge. I just feel that this particular amendment is drafted way too broadly, and is fraught with unintended consequences. Again, I'm not asking the gentleman to withdraw his amendment. If there was a much more narrow, tailored approach, I myself would be very happy to entertain that. I believe the gentleman from Kentucky wished to have further comment.
Just one further comment, and that is, and I also appreciate the gentleman from Washington and his passion about this, and I too would be concerned if an adversarial foreign power exercised control over critical infrastructure in the United States, and there was no review of that. But what we're talking about here with the particular amendment and the language that's offered is extraordinarily broad. It would ensnare, it would include, it would extend CFIUS jurisdiction to any entity that provide any services to an entity that operated within a critical infrastructure sector. And again, the only reference we have to the definition of critical infrastructure in the entire federal government is an extraordinarily broad list of industries that includes restaurants, that includes manufacturing facilities that have nothing to do with national security whatsoever. So so we believe what we've done here is narrowly tailored the focus of CFIUS on the real problem. And the real problem is China and other adversaries stealing critical technologies and our intellectual property. And from that standpoint, what we don't want to do is take CFIUS's focus off of the issue. We don't want to take their eye off the ball, and this amendment, unfortunately, unintentionally would do that. And I yield back.
The chairman yields back. The chairman wishes to apprise all members of the fact that a vote is currently taking place on the floor with 9 minutes and 28 seconds left on the vote. Who seeks recognition? Is there further debate on the amendment? We're still debating the amendment from the gentleman from Washington. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair. The nays appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition? A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on this amendment are postponed. As the chair informed members earlier, we intend to recess now, pending the conclusion of both floor votes and the conclusion of debate on S-2155. At that point, we will reconvene with further debate on this bill. The committee stands in recess.